Well, we are excited to introduce y'all to Dr. Jennifer Garcia Bashaw, a dear friend of mine. And really, if you're a part of TRP, she should not be a new face. She has actually preached for us. When was that? A year ago?
That sounds about right.
It's so hard to keep track of time these days. It could have been a year. It could have been, it wasn't 20 years ago, but somewhere in that frame, I think. And we are also thankful for the video that you did for our new series, Reconstructed Parenting. For those who haven't been able to see it yet, Jennifer, could you just kind of describe the problem that you're addressing in that video?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up hearing a particular articulation of the gospel that I realize now after studying the New Testament that it does a poor job of explaining the gospel. But this is an explanation of the gospel that is still very popular, that people use with children and people of all ages. And so I wanted to say maybe there's a different way to talk about this gospel that reflects what's in the Bible a little bit more. And so that's what I do. I talk about that and then talk about maybe how are some ways that parents might introduce this gospel, this biblical gospel, to their children. So that's kind of what I do.
So you're a New Testament scholar by trade. This is really in your wheelhouse, specifically this idea of different atonement theories and such. But could you break down specifically the type of gospel that you were prone to hear as a kid and that you find to be maybe problematic now?
Yeah, it would probably be a mixture of several different things, but mainly revolved around the idea of penal substitutionary atonement. That's what we'll call it, PSA sometimes. But the idea is that we're sinful people. We need to be judged by God, or that God is angry with us or something. And so the way that God takes care of that is by sending his son to die for our sins. And that sort of either pays the price, or there's like maybe purifies us. There's a lot of metaphors that are used in this. And so then we're able to go to heaven when we die because of what Jesus did on the cross. And there's blood involved, and there's, all sorts of imagery like that.
Yeah, it sounds really scary, right?
Yes. And especially if you see it like in picture form, because I remember it was a Good Friday when my kids were younger, and we went to this church and they had like a picture of Jesus on the cross, and there was like lots of blood, and it was dark and stormy, and it freaked them out. Yeah. Like that image. But that's like an image that comes up when you talk about the gospel in that way. So
yeah, why do you think that particular image of explaining Jesus's death, why has that gained so much traction?
Good question, but I think it's because we focus on language from Paul's letters, that his language does focus on the cross quite a bit, cross and resurrection. But he doesn't talk a lot about Jesus's life for whatever reason, most likely because he's already told them about Jesus's life. And so he's just reminding them about things. But, throughout church history, we have returned to those images, and we kind of take them out of their context and make them fit our context. And we lose a lot in between. Protestant Reformation probably did a little bit of that, where, they were focusing more on Paul's letters, and they had particular ideas they wanted to get across, legal language, things like that. So yeah, I think it has to do with, historically speaking, when we go back to Paul, but we leave out Jesus's life and ministry in the Gospels, then we get this sort of cross-centered imagery that doesn't have anything really on either side.
Yeah, now, I want to get to the benefits of talking about Jesus's life and ministry, but before we get there, there's other images in the New Testament used to explain Jesus's death, right?
Right.
I mean, there's any number of them. Could you give us one or two of your favorites? That sounds like a weird question, but something that you would say might provide a better explanation of the crucifixion that's not quite Jesus had a dad and he was really angry at him, or, so
Right.
he had to die for us because we're terrible people, like that sort of. What's a better way of explaining that?
Well, there is one that has become really popular and has been popular throughout church history, and that is just to talk about, this sort of larger battle between good and evil,
Mhm.
and that Jesus on the cross defeated the powers of evil. And then we call that Christus Victor, but there's a lot that goes on behind that, and I'm not really sure that that's the actual imagery that I would use when I'm talking to children. I think that it would be better to go back and look at Jesus's life and take it in its context. Like, why did Jesus die on the cross? Because people killed him
Yeah.
because of what he said. I feel like with children, that's what we should be explaining, not sort of what's happening off stage in the cosmic realm. I think we should be talking about what actually happened, and then I think we can get to the gospel that way better.
Yeah. So talk more about Jesus's life. What are some of your favorite images or stories that you could depend on to show kids how cool Jesus is?
Ooh. Well, I think, any story that you pick where Jesus is healing people, I think is these are really helpful images. But then you'd have to kind of explain that Jesus was healing people for several reasons. I mean, yes, he cared about them and he had compassion on their situation, but that it was also showing a bigger picture, that the way that God wants things to be in the world is that we will be whole and healed, right? And so Jesus was showing us little pictures of that. So different things are going on there. I think a good one is, and this, I mean, you can do several different versions of it, but the one in Mark works really well. It's when the friends bring the man who is paralyzed to Jesus, and they have to, dig through the roof and they lower him down so he can see Jesus. And when Jesus heals him, he says that he's healing him because of the faith of the friends, or the people who brought him. And so then you get this picture, not just of Jesus healing, but you get this picture of sort of community involvement, right? And then you can talk about how, what Jesus did on earth was helpful for a whole community, and it was showing us how we can flourish if we're living under God's rule. And so you can kind of go from there and talk more about God's kingdom on earth.
Yeah. And you hit on this in the video too, like the contrast between how we think now about salvation as really individualized, like it's a me thing, whereas in the New Testament it seems to be much more communal. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and not just communal, but all of creation.
Yeah, that's
So
good.
when you do take lots of different stories of Jesus, like I don't encourage people to just focus on one, you'll see that he is not just healing people, but he's feeding people and he's teaching people. And there are crowds and there are all different kinds of people there. But he also has this sort of control over nature when you're talking about him calming the sea, walking on water. And so you get this idea that Jesus's power, if you kind of get all the pictures together, then you see that it's not just communal what Jesus is doing, it's also for all of creation.
Yeah. Um, that I think that's part of what you were talking about as well when you say it's better to think about maybe expanding our language when we talk about the gospel, when we talk about salvation. As a parent, I think some people might feel intimidated by that, as if they have to know the entire Bible and all the stories that are included in it. Can you maybe give us a few tips on how to think beyond? I don't know if you'll love this as a New Testament person and as a Gospels person, but thinking beyond just those four books into, placing Jesus's story in the larger, grander narrative that's going on in the Bible. Can you give us some tips on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to shortcut things because I mean, I can understand how parents would get overwhelmed or something, but I do think that oh, you know what, you could go and watch the Bible Project videos or something,
Yeah,
just to give
yeah,
you like an overview. They have several overview videos, like this is the story of scripture. Or this is even the introductory video to the New Testament goes back and tells the Old Testament story and then picks up and how it connects. I mean, not everything in the Bible Project is perfect, but it is helpful if you need a framework to kind of to look at. But yeah, I mean, that's what I think that's the best way for, parents who don't want to pick up a whole introduction to the Bible or something like that. I really feel like that's the best way to do it, to get the big picture. But I don't want people to be intimidated about reading the Gospels and thinking that it's only talking about what's happening in Jesus's life and ministry, because we're supposed to be able to put ourselves in the stories, and that's why they're stories, they're narratives, because we're supposed to put ourselves in them and look at that and how that describes all of humanity, how that describes all of history, how that those stories connect to us today. So
yeah, we talk about this a lot at TRP as well. Even just diving into the Gospels, like in order to understand what's going on there, you've got to have a little bit of background knowledge in the Old Testament, because everything these folks are saying is sort of what's that little throwaway line? The New Testament is a footnote to the Old Testament or something like that.
Yeah.
Like there's so much more depth that colors our reading of the Bible when we can place it in its context. So, all right, go to the Bible Project. There we go. Shortcut.
But you should be the one that's talking about how do we get a good picture of what's happening in the Old Testament. You should be telling them that.
No, I'm bringing on the experts like yourself to do my work for me.
You are the Old Testament expert, not me.
I always encourage people just to curl up after a long day of parenting with their Old Testament introductions and just start combing through and seeing what put Netflix on pause for a bit and read some scholarship stuff. You talk also about expanding not just the story and our understanding of the story beyond that focus on Jesus and his death and his resurrection. You also talk about expanding the language that we use to describe some of those things. Here's the thing. I feel like so many people learn their language from the songs that they sing at church, which the stuff you've talked about, like blood, justification, purification, like those are in there. And also the sermons that people hear usually lean on something like penal substitutionary atonement. How can people kind of expand the language? Is there a way that we can kind of get new terms given to us?
I would have to get you a list of songs later, but there are some songs being written that people are using in worship that use more community language, more kingdom language, bigger picture view. But if we focus on so the word kingdom, I don't love, but it is the biblical word, right? But words like the reign of God, asking questions about what was Jesus doing on earth, and then we're talking about starting the kingdom of God. There is this word kingdom. Have we talked about this before?
Yes, we have.
I like that word, but using it with kids, they don't really know what kin means. But I think kingdom talks about more the family aspect, how we are all part of the family of God. And so it's not just someone who's ruling above us or something, but the reign and the priorities of God coming to earth, and then us being involved in this family affair. So I think family language, community language, kingdom or kingdom language helps, because you're not just focusing on cross, blood, individualism. You're looking at the big picture.
Yeah. Talk also about you say things about salvation not being in another context. I think you've used the word punctiliar. Like it's not just a thing that happens at once. Although, like in our cultural context, and especially in your church background, people are writing dates in the front of their Bibles. Like it's a moment. You get the commitment card, and celebrations are happening. How can we move away from thinking about salvation as something that happens in a moment, a hand raised, a prayer that's prayed, to salvation as a journey, or something that's developing over time.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think we have revivalism, I think, to thank for that whole idea of the moment, and that it just kind of has changed the way, especially evangelical Christianity has looked at salvation. But I think to move away from that, we can borrow something from our Methodist brothers and sisters and our Episcopalian brothers and sisters, where they look at, I'm not saying to baptize babies because I am a Baptist, but but I understand why they do it. You have that this baby is being brought into a community of faith, right? And then you're starting a journey, and that journey, has different steps along the way, sort of, confirmation and things like that. So I think that is a helpful way of looking at it, that we, can belong to God from the very beginning and start a process from the very beginning, and then look at it as a journey, and not like one moment where you just say, I'm gonna follow Jesus. I mean, it doesn't have to be like that. It can be, and it has been for some people, but I think if we speak about it in that only in that way, and it makes people feel like they have to have a moment, or that their relationship with God is not valid because they didn't have a moment, and I think we want to avoid that for sure.
Yeah. And I think if we pitch that to kids, and even like if we pitch that to parents, think about the benefits, because even now, like, I don't know how you would describe this for yourself, Jennifer, but I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Like, if we want to use the word deconstruction, that's been something that's happened to me. And I bet lots of the parents listening too would find themselves maybe even wondering, am I saved? Because of that whole, it's this thing, and then you don't stray from the path. So if we kind of blow that up, think about all the beautiful benefits that we're giving to our kids by not having them be anxious ridden over, am I in or am I out? Am I going to the good place or the bad place? You know what I mean?
Yes, that when we don't draw boundaries, then we're not going to be, excluding people or asking that question, who's in or who's out. I think so. When I get students in my classroom that have been sort of preached to this sort of heaven and hell and make a decision and all that, like when I teach them what the Bible actually says about things, they get so worked up, they get angry, they get despondent, like lots of things, like emotions go on. But then I have other students who hadn't been taught that really in and out, that black and white, that heaven and hell, and they just receive it so well. So I would love the idea of us raising these kids who don't have to deconstruct, because like you're constructing a sound building, right?
Yeah.
Not something that will have to be demolished later in order to actually get the understanding of God and the kingdom and salvation and all of that.
I don't know if you've experienced this, but it seems like that's one of the conversations that's ongoing with maybe more progressive types. Like, do we have to build the structure that we had so that it can be blown up, so that kids can sort of deconstruct and move? Or if we give them totally new cards to play with, are they going to end up way better than we are? I've seen people kind of wrestle with that.
Yeah.
I know, like, I'm not building the same structure that I was given for my kids.
Right. No, me neither. And I see it now. I have a 16-year-old, 13-year-old, and 10-year-old. And like, I have never talked to my children about hell. But I have talked about journeys and talked about, following Jesus and talked about the character of God and all that. They are phenomenal kids. Like my 16-year-old son is more Christ-like than I was at 16, and I was like the champ of youth ministry. You know what I'm saying? So I was afraid for a while, like if I don't give them this like salvation message where they have to make the decision, what's going to happen? Are they going to go astray or something? But it hasn't happened, and I think that I was just afraid because my upbringing made me afraid.
What would you say to parents that are wrestling with that? Like, if I don't tell my kids about hell, I'm being a bad Christian. I'm being a bad witness. I'm being a bad, evangelist for my kids. What would you say to those folks that feel like, that old school salvation message is really important and they're feeling that weight? How would you help coach
Well,
them?
I would say, first of all, that hell is not real. The way that we describe and talk about hell is not in the Bible. It's not biblical. So, like, they would just be, feeling bad about something they were taught in church, not about what is actually in the Bible. And it would take a whole nother lesson to talk about how hell is not really in the Bible. But maybe you can just trust me.
Oh, yeah.
The idea of hell that we have, this eternal, conscious punishment that we're supposed to hold in front of people to make them scared so they'll follow God, like, that's not biblical.
Yeah.
So I say, don't feel bad about not teaching them about hell. Like, they're going to understand more about the character of God if you don't teach them about hell.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, we're already here. Give us the 2-paragraph pitch on what the Bible and Jesus are really talking about when they talk about hell. No pressure.
Jesus uses the word most often. Jesus uses the word Gehenna when he talks about fire, everlasting fire is what it gets translated as. And we believe, scholars pretty much across the board believe that he's talking about a place that's sort of outside of Jerusalem, that has some Old Testament history, that's like, there at one point there was like a burning trash heap there. I don't think that happened the whole time, but it was like that's a horrible place with bad memories. You don't want to go there. And so when he's talking about things like it's better to pluck out your eye than your whole body to be thrown into Gehenna, he's talking about like a really bad place outside of Jerusalem that people knew about. It would be like a little bit of a warning, but he's not talking about some other realm that exists. That's just not, it wasn't even in the minds of Jewish people at that time.
Right. We usually gravitate more towards Dante.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And Jesus,
which was like what, 14th century, like in the 1300s.
Super late. Yeah. And not what Jesus is up to. Can you have that conversation with a kid? I don't know why.
That's why I wouldn't even bring it up. Like, I wouldn't bring it up. And then we haven't been going to churches lately that preach hellfire and brimstone, so they don't hear it. They have never asked me a question about hell. I think I've heard them say once, well, I don't believe the merciful God would send people to hell. I've heard my 16-year-old say that, and I've never said that to him. He must have heard about it somewhere, but he was like, that's not the God I know. Yeah,
just roll with that. It sounds like your kids are getting it. My kids, however, are 8 and almost 6, and they ask crazy questions. Like, we've talked about hell before, but I usually give them you see, in its first century Jewish context, what Jesus is doing is, and I go into my kids are not set up for success. I think they're set up to be the strange ones in their Sunday school classes, probably. But yeah, hopefully we can steer clear of some of that. Now, do you also, I don't know if you know this, but like, Pete Enns has written a kids curriculum, and his whole thing is, don't talk about all the violent stuff in the Old Testament. Hang out with Jesus in the Gospels as you're training your kids. Would you go that far with it, or would you still kind of expose them to all of these stories that could potentially be really hard to explain?
I have exposed my kids to Old Testament stories, but I try to put it in the bigger framework of God's relationship with Israel. Also, the way I talk about the Bible is that humans wrote it in their time period. They had certain ideas. They're trying to talk about God the best that they can. So I do introduce them to Old Testament things, but not sort of outside of the context. I have to give them a little bit of background.
So I think you just hit a really important point when you stressed, like, I talk about how the Bible is written by humans in their context. Some people, in my experience, have wondered, well, what's the point? Like, why are we wrestling so hard with this book when we have to over-explain all of its problems and say, like, oh, well, it doesn't really mean this, it means that. Oh, they weren't really saying this, they were saying that. Oh, it's problematic in our context, but it's not problematic in their context. what would you say to somebody who's like, are we still even reading the Bible?
Ooh, I would say that because Jesus is so central to our faith, and we have to understand Jesus's story and then his life. And then we can also talk about how the people who first followed Jesus were. Like, I think that is really important. It gives us a picture of the character of God, I think, and it tells a story that we are part of. So we need to go back to it. And I don't know. I mean, there we do have to explain things, but I don't feel like it's, a huge burden to just say, this is ancient literature. Like when you study Shakespeare, well, when I'm talking to my 13-year-old, you have to talk about what's going on at the time period. Like, I don't feel like it's a huge burden, but I mean, I can understand how it would be hard for people who, aren't used to talking about that.
Yeah, I think you and I might relish those opportunities. Like when the kids are saying, "Hey, Dad, tell me about this," and then they're in the back seat and we're riding, to their grandparents' house or something. I'm like, "Yes!" And then we get to unpack, ancient Near Eastern context, or talk a little Hebrew or Greek. So that might be where you and I are the weird ones in the bunch.
Mhm.
But
There's another way to do that, and it is just to say, I don't know.
yes,
Like, I feel like it's okay to say to your kids, I'm not really sure. And we don't know for sure. But what we do know is what we see in Jesus's life and how he cared for the poor and the oppressed, and he loved people and showed the character of God, that God is forgiving. Like, we can keep reminding them of the things we know,
yeah.
and then talk about there are lots of things we don't know.
Yeah, that's great. And also, did you get that as a kid? Did you get an adult saying, "I don't know" to you?
No, it felt like every adult had to give me some sort of answer, some explanation.
Yeah, like when we were talking about, giving our kids something different than what we had, that's a really beautiful first step, is just to
Mm.
be able to honestly admit, this is a tough book, and there's some stuff in it that I'm not so sure I know.
Yeah.
And allowing kids to sort of sit with that. And then also, like where you took us in your video, is to say, you ask those orienting questions about, like, I forget what they are now, but like, what would you be thinking if you were in this story, or how would you respond if you were this character or that character? Um, I think that's a beautiful way that requires very little training or knowledge, right? It just takes a parent being willing to get a kid to imagine, because as you say, kids come to better readings than we do a lot of the time.
Mhm. And the stories in the Gospels are just so life-giving. I mean, even just reading them to your children and asking questions about them, the character of Jesus comes alive. You just feel what's happening. I feel like the way that the gospel writers wrote, it's there. I don't think we go back to them very often.
Yeah. And again, like we started this video with saying, there's a lot of comparison between what the kids get and what the adults get from sermons.
Mm.
And man, there'd just be so much beauty if we could be able to sort of, invite our parishioners, our congregants into that sort of response. Like, this isn't just a kid thing, right? This is a
Yeah.
really beautiful way to approach scripture in general, by placing yourself in the story and asking these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I hoped, as I made the video, I kept thinking, like, I am talking about the gospel for kids, but this is the gospel
Yeah.
for everybody. Like,
I was thinking that too, just wondering, like, this is going to be, I think, news and life-giving for some parents that have felt constrained, or that have just felt confused by, this doesn't sound like good news,
mm,
like mad dad in the sky punishing his kid because I'm terrible. That's not good news.
mm,
So getting excited about that can be difficult, but kind of swinging those doors open and allowing people to see things in a different way is really cool. Well, Jennifer, this has been awesome. One final question, I guess, because I imagine parents might want to know something about resources. Are there any places or things, other than the Bible Project, of course, that you
mm.
would send parents to? Maybe even like good kid Bibles that exist or might soon exist.
Yeah. So I've talked with a couple of my children's minister friends recently, but actually all the ones that are my friends are all in progressive churches right now. And then I say, so what Bible do you recommend for children? And they go, well, the Jesus Storybook Bible for now, because there really haven't been a lot of good ones out there. What's good about the Jesus Storybook Bible is like there are pictures that represent what the people would have actually looked like at that time. It's poetic. There are beautiful pictures. I think it misleads a little bit with some of the Old Testament stories, and it still has problems. But there are new things coming out in the next year or a year and a half. It's sad how long these things take. There is one that's out right now, I think. It's not like a book, it's not like a Bible. I have my little cheat sheet here. It's called I Wonder. It is sort of like a storybook. I Wonder, Exploring God's Grand Story.
Mm-hmm.
And the name of the person who wrote it is Glennis Nellist. And it says that, it was published in September. So that one should be out. There's another one that's called The Book of Belonging that's coming out in the next year or so. That was actually a Kickstarter. There are these two women that decided they needed a better Bible for their children. Yeah. And the one who was inspired to do it, her daughter had asked her, does God love boys more than girls? Because she had been reading her children's Bible and all the stories were about boys. There was like one, maybe two stories about girls. And she was just floored. She started looking through all the, Bible storybooks and stuff and saw like not only were there not enough representation of women or girls, but the people weren't diverse. The Holy Spirit wasn't talked about. The angels were blonde, like all these things that she said, oh, we need to fix this. And so she raised money and they got enough money. And so they're in the process of doing that. So the Book of Belonging. And then another one's coming out January 2023 by Esau McCauley, and it's called God's Colorful Kingdom Storybook Bible. And so he's going to talk a lot about diversity, but also looking at the story of Jesus, from the perspective of the people who were in the stories, who wrote the stories from the perspective of the poor and the oppressed, right?
Nice.
So those are good. They're coming out.
And Jennifer, go ahead and plug your own work. You got a book coming out too that's not really related to teaching children.
It's not for children, but it is coming out in May, and it's called Scapegoats, the Gospel Through the Eyes of Victims. And I get, pretty into the Gospels there. And I'm talking about not just the Gospels, but sort of all of church history, and talking about how we should read the Gospels from the perspective of the victim, because that's really who were the people that wrote it and what it's about. And then I talk about how throughout history, the church has made people victims sometimes instead of standing up for the victim. And so then I talk about how we can change that as a church.
Awesome. Well, we will look forward to that. Thank you so much for your time. I'll just go ahead and invite folks, if they have questions or comments, to drop them in whatever forum we are in the comment section, and we'll try to get those answers to you. So thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate it.
Thanks.